Welcome to Beyond the March, Martin Luther King Jr. in Washington, D.C. And this is part of our Teach 250 Inspiring a More Perfect Union series during the 250th anniversary of our country. And my name is Jeremy Goldstein, and I work at the Trust for the National Mall, a partner to the National Park Service. In fact, the Trust for the National Mall is the philanthropic partner to the National Park Service on the National Mall, as well as the White House grounds President's Park. And what we do is we support the National Park Service through programming and helping support the volunteer program as well. We also, as you see on your screen, have the National Mall Gateway, which is a site and platform that allows you to access the National Mall either digitally from your own home or directly on site. You can carry it around on your phone. It's optimized for mobile, and it contains lesson plans and resources. We are also partnered with DC 250, and the DC 250 year in education has a bunch of themes, including the story of us, hidden histories, crafted expression, the power of your voice, civic engagement and public discourse, and the future of freedom and DC's favorite pastime. So when you tune into these, you'll be getting a whole bunch of different subjects that you can take back to your classroom. Hopefully you'll walk out of here inspired to talk about interesting 250 pieces to enhance your curriculum and your lessons. In addition, DC is the best place to celebrate America's 250th birthday. We're biased because we work at the National Mall with the National Park Service, but really consider visiting dc250.us, which not only has all the events that are happening live, but great resources across the Washington, D.C. area, the greater D.C. area as well. And there is an education dc250.us education website specifically designed for educators and specifically talking about the DC 250 experience and tuning into what educators may need for their classrooms. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to our partners at the Park Service, and I'll stop sharing. Thanks for tuning in. We're looking forward to a great session.
Thank you, Jeremy. We're excited to continue our partnership with you on this program and bring you another exciting Teach 250 program tonight. So Ranger Bethany and I were talking about stories that we could tell that might be a little bit unique and different. And we were thinking about the idea of Martin Luther King and how familiar we all are with the March on Washington story. And wouldn't it be neat to look into maybe some different aspects of Dr. King's legacy, particularly here in Washington, D.C. And when we started kind of looking into some of the activities that he participated in before the 1963 March, we found that a lot of his activities were inspired by the Brown versus Board of Education decision. And that got us thinking about the fact that, well, I'll speak for myself here. Maybe I don't know as much about that as I should. And hey, we have a National Park Service site that is all about the Brown versus Board of Education decision. And so we invited Ranger Fatima to come join us tonight to give us a little introduction to the Brown versus Board of Education decision and introduce us to this story. And then Ranger Bethany's going to share some of the connections that we made to Dr. King's visits in Washington, D.C. that are kind of a direct correlation to this landmark civil rights case. So I'm really excited to welcome Ranger Fatima to our program this evening. And if you should have any questions along the way, you can throw them in the chat box. We'll make sure she answers them before we let her leave. And thank you for joining us tonight, and it's all yours for right now.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Jennifer. And my name is Fatima Purvis, and I'm the education specialist at Brown v. Board of Education National Historical Park. And today we're going to learn all about the Brown decision, and then Jennifer's going to tell you a little bit more information about how Dr. King took that information and basically catapulted the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. Okay. Okay, sorry for the technical difficulties. But so Brown v. Board of Education essentially is, or we're stationed in Topeka, Kansas, and the building that you see on the screen is one of four or one of five areas of the entire Brown v. Board of Education class, the lawsuits. So the mission statement of the National Park Service is to preserve unimpaired the natural and cultural resources and the values of the national park system for the enjoyment, education, and inspiration of this and future generations. And here's a little bit of information about myself. My name is Fatima Purvis, and I'm the education specialist at Brown v. Board of Education, National Historical Park. I enjoyed a career as a trained educator, and I also worked at various civil rights parks and sites throughout the United States, especially in the state of Alabama. So Plessy v. Ferguson was like the precursor to Brown v. Board of Education. Plessy v. Ferguson dealt with separate and equal facilities in New Orleans, Louisiana. So on June 7th, 1892, a gentleman named Homer Plessy, who was 1/8 Black, was arrested for refusing to move from a train car that was reserved for white patrons. His arrest was performed in order to protest a new Louisiana law which required separate accommodations for different races via the Separate Train Car Act. Excuse me. And Judge Ferguson upheld the law, and the case of Plessy v. Ferguson slowly moved up to the Supreme Court. And on May 18th, 1896, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal facilities were constitutional. And it took approximately 60 years for the Plessy v. Ferguson decision to be overturned, beginning with Brown v. Board of Education. And here are a few images that show you what separate and equal facilities or equal accommodations looked like in the United States. So on the left, we have a young man that is drinking from a segregated water fountain for people of color. And on the right, we have a gentleman of color, and he's entering a balcony of a segregated movie theater. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People was founded in 1909 by Ida B. Wells, Henry Moskowitz, and W.E.B. Du Bois. And it was the organization's founding purpose to ensure the political, education, social, and economic equality of rights of all persons and to eliminate racial hatred and discrimination in the U.S. And Charles Hamilton Houston, we kind of credit him with being the father of Brown v. Board of Education. So the NAACP in the early 1920s or 1930s hired Charles Houston as their first special counsel. Mr. Houston revised the report that was written by Nathan Margold, and he decided to target segregation starting in graduate schools and professional schools to set a legal precedent. His legal work laid the groundwork for Brown v. Board of Education. Unfortunately, his health failed and he did not live to see the outcome of the Brown decision. The Legal Defense and Educational Fund was a separate but closely related to organization or a separate but similar organization that worked closely with the NAACP. Their purpose was to raise money to challenge segregation by legal action, and Thurgood Marshall was the lead attorney for the Legal Defense Fund. He was also the mentee of Charles Hamilton Houston. So Charles Houston taught Thurgood Marshall everything he knew. He was also Thurgood Marshall's educator at the Howard University Law School. And here we have a map of school segregation in the United States before 1954. So the map is color coordinated. We have the states that are shaded red, and they were former slaveholding states. They also mandated segregation. So segregation was not an option in any of those areas. The states that are shaded green prohibited segregation. The states that are shaded white did not have any specific laws or rules on segregation. And there are 4 states that are shaded orange, and those states permitted segregation, but they were laws that were put into place to keep them from in order for them to be able to segregate their schools. So with the Brown v. Board of Education, there were 5 class action lawsuits from 5 different areas, and 4 of the 5 cases were from the southern states or the southeastern states. Okay, so with Brown v. Board of Education, the first case to be tried in the district court was Briggs v. Elliott in Clarendon County, South Carolina. We also have a case that's titled Bowling versus Sharp in Washington, D.C. And then the Virginia case is titled Davis v. the County School Board of Prince Edward County. The Delaware cases, there were 2 consolidated cases in Delaware, and they were called Belting v. Gephardt and Bewley v. Gephardt. And then the case in Kansas was called or titled Brown versus the Board of Education. And on the image to the left, we have some of the plaintiffs from the schools in Farmville, Virginia. So Briggs v. Elliott took place in South Carolina in 1950, and the communities faced severe educational inequalities with no buses for those children. Some of the children walked 5 miles to school and 5 miles back home. The NAACP's strategy relied on presenting psychological evidence of the harmful effects that segregation had on young children, and despite this, the petitioners lost in district court, and it resulted in the plaintiffs losing their job. Some of them lost their land, and some of the plaintiffs even were forced to leave the state. And on the screen, we have 2 pictures of 2 schools that were supposed to be separate and equal. The school on the left is one of several schools for Black children. It was a 2-room building. And then the school on the right is a school for white children in the 1940s in South Carolina. And we see that there are 2 floors on the building, and then they also have adequate lighting, and their children also had access to transportation as well. Bowling versus Sharp took place in Washington, D.C., and the case was filed in district court in 1951. And in 1950, which was a year prior, some of the schools or children were faced with unequal facilities, outdated textbooks, and overcrowded classrooms. The NAACP attempted to enroll the children in the newly built John Philip Sousa Junior High School, but they were denied admission. The case was dismissed by judges who cited previous court decisions which allowed school segregation in Washington, D.C. So John Philip Sousa High School is pictured to the left, and we have an image of parents picketing for equal schools in Washington, D.C. in the image to the right. The next set of cases are Belton, Beulah v. Gephardt, and it took place in Claymont, Delaware in 1951. So we had 2 cases that addressed the same issues, equality in order to attend those schools. The state refused to provide transportation, stating that colored children could not ride buses that served white children, and they also refused to allow Black students to integrate into those white schools. The plaintiffs won in the district court, which ruled that the separate but equal doctrine had been violated though the decision applied only to the specific schools in the case. The NAACP was not satisfied with this. Although they won the court case, they weren't satisfied. So they in turn appealed this case to the U.S. Supreme Court, and it became one of the 5 cases of Brown v. Board of Education. Davis v. the County School Board of Prince Edward County happened in Farmville, Virginia. And in Farmville in 1951, African-American schools were overcrowded. So a young lady named Barbara Johns and 117 of her peers led a strike, and they also sought assistance from their local NAACP chapter. So the issues that they were facing in their separate and unequal schools were that the children were attending schools in tar paper shacks, and school buses that no longer operated. And the tar paper shacks were not permanent structures. So when it would rain outside, the rain would seep through the roof and the children would become wet, their papers would become wet, etc. So they had to raise their umbrellas in the classroom. And this happened for a very long time. So Barbara Johns was dissatisfied with the educational opportunities that they were provided. And they, of course, petitioned the Board of Education to let them integrate into those segregated schools for white children. The last of the 5 cases is Brown v. Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas. And on the screen, we have 2 schools that were truly separate and equal. The school on the left was one of 4 schools for African American children. It was a brick and mortar building. And then the school on the right, which is Randolph Elementary School, was one of 18 schools for white children, which was a brick and mortar building. The architect, Mr. Thomas Williamson, designed the schools to look truly equal on the interior of the building. And we'll be able to see 2 images of the segregated classrooms for those children. So Topeka was a little bit different because they were not fighting for the right to integrate into better educational facilities. They were simply petitioning to integrate into the schools that were closer to their neighborhoods. Topeka's neighborhoods were fully integrated, but by the 1920s, they segregated schools for Black children and for white children. So some of those African American children had to take public transportation for much further distances in order to reach a school for Black children. The NAACP's argument was that the schools in Topeka were unusually equal. And the images to the right show 2 separate classrooms in 2 different buildings. The image on the top is located or was taken in Monroe School, which is the building that I'm sitting in right now. And the school at the bottom was located at, or the picture at the bottom was located at Randolph School, which was one of the 18 schools for Black children. And if I did not tell you that these schools were these pictures were taken in 2 different buildings, you would have assumed that the images were taken in the same building. And all of the children had access to transportation. They all had books, they had desks, adequate school supplies, and their teachers were paid according to their level of education and not according to their race or gender. So most of the African American female teachers had master's degrees because they knew that they would be paid according to their level of education and not according to their race. So in some instances, the African American female teachers made more money than the white male teachers based on the level of their education. Now on this screen, we'll watch a short video and we will discuss the baby doll study on the next slide. And this basically helped to overturn the separate but equal doctrine in public educational facilities. So those were not actual participants in the baby doll test, but that was a more modern recreation of the baby doll study. And in Clarendon County, South Carolina, child psychologist Dr. Kenneth Clark took 2 baby dolls, a Black baby doll and a white baby doll, and he asked those children in South Carolina which baby doll was the nice doll, the smart doll, etc. And more than 60% of those children favored the white doll. And when he asked the children questions such as which doll is the bad doll, the dumb doll, etc., more than 60% of the children pointed to the African American baby doll. And then the last question was a very simple question. He asked the children, which baby doll looks most like you? Some of the children refused to answer the question. Some of the children shamefully pointed to the black baby doll, and one African American girl smiled and pointed to the white baby doll as the doll that looked like her because she did not want to be associated with the black baby doll. So the NAACP took the findings from the baby doll study and presented that information to the U.S. Supreme Court while highlighting the unusually equal facilities in Topeka, Kansas. And the Supreme Court's justices were alarmed. They saw the harm that was happening not to only black children, but to white children, because the white children were feeling as though they were superior to the black children. And they unanimously overturned the separate but equal doctrine on May 17th, 1954. And Brown v. Board of Education is the first time cited any psychological evidence in their official opinion. And on the screen, you can see to the left, we have the Supreme Court's justices of 1954, with Earl Warren being the Chief Justice. And then on the right-hand side, we have 3 of the NAACP's attorneys standing on the steps of the U.S. Supreme Court after the Brown v. Board of Education ruling came out. So after Brown v. Board of Education was decided in 1954, all schools did not integrate. The schools in Prince Edward County closed for more than 5 years. Barbara Johns, the young lady who led the strike, was threatened by segregationists, and she was forced to relocate to live in Montgomery, Alabama. Mr. Harry Briggs of Briggs v. Elliott was fired from his job, and he was forced to leave to relocate to a different area on the East Coast. Non-tenured African American teachers in Topeka were given a notice from the Board of Education stating that they were going to lose their jobs after the Brown decision. And some schools, as I mentioned earlier, did not integrate immediately throughout the United States. And then on the right-hand side, we have an image of students peacefully protesting the closing of Prince Edward County's schools after the Brown decision. So here's a little bit of information about the park. Monroe School closed in 1975 due to decreasing student enrollment. The Monroe School was listed as a National Historic Landmark in 1991 and became a unit of the National Park Service in 1992. The Visitor Center officially opened to the public on May 17th, 2004, on the 50th anniversary of the landmark Brown v. Board of Education decision. And that concludes my presentation.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Gosh, now I want to go visit. Do we have any questions real quick for Fatima before we turn this into kind of connect it to the DC portion of our story? Although you hit on a DC story that, yeah, a little bit of info there. You got thank you in the chat. Excellent. Okay, you want to get your screen going there? Ranger Bethany is going to connect some dots maybe here and help us continue the story. As Fatima was saying, after Brown decision, I was thinking, oh, you know, that should fit right in nicely to where we're going, right into the next part and the kind of reaction and how did it play out here. So I will turn it over to Bethany. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. We're just going to do a kind of a quick brief overview of really sort of 3 consecutive marches that would bring Dr. King and other civil rights leaders to Washington, D.C., mostly and in many cases on the anniversary of the Brown versus Board of Education decision. And many of these marches were centered around the fact that many states refused to implement the decisions, while other states were simply dragging their feet. And so the idea was to come to Washington to press leaders, to press the federal government to act on the implementation. And so the first march that we'll talk about wasn't even called a march. It was actually referred to as a prayer pilgrimage for freedom. The reason they used the term pilgrimage is they wanted to not only commemorate the Brown versus Board of Education decision, but also to really encourage and inspire the federal government to make the court's decision a reality, or as A. Philip Randolph would say, to make a deep and effective impression upon President Eisenhower and other government officials. So this march or this pilgrimage would essentially culminate here at the Lincoln Memorial. This is a very iconic view. The Lincoln Memorial would be used time and time again for many marches, as well as a forum to speak out against injustices. And Dr. King would travel and speak at the Lincoln Memorial several times. Of course, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom and his I Have a Dream speech is perhaps the most iconic of all the speeches. But it's going to be during this pilgrimage that he's also going to give a speech that really will be the highlight of this march. And in many ways, it kind of sort of propels him to the national stage. And so this pilgrimage was organized by many notable civil rights leaders, including Roy Wilkins, A. Philip Randolph, Fred Shuttlesworth, as well as Dr. King. He would ultimately end up speaking last. And his speech was known as "Give Us the Ballot." And what Dr. King was trying to emphasize was that voting rights were essential to the goal of integration. And that he also stressed that people must never become bitter and should meet hate with love and physical force with soul force. And so what he says in his speech is, "Give us the ballot, and we will quietly and nonviolently, without rancor or bitterness, implement the Supreme Court's decision of May 17th, 1954. So the idea would be that they would elect leaders who would support this idea of integration, especially of all public schools in the United States. This was a very well-received speech. Again, it kind of makes Dr. King, if he wasn't already, a very sort of household name. And so we're going to see Dr. King start to organize more and more marches and demonstrations and protests and pilgrimage throughout the country. But of course, this one is to highlight and to commemorate the 3rd anniversary of the Brown versus Board of Education decision. It was estimated that anywhere between 25 to 30,000 people would attend the pilgrimage to Washington, D.C. And so again, this happens in 1957. Now, coming on the heels of this would be a second march that would take place in Washington, D.C. This would be the Youth March for Integrated Schools. There's a march that happens in 1958 as well as 1959. And kind of the idea behind these youth marches is let the children lead. So the 1958 occurred on the 4th anniversary of the decision of Brown versus Board of Education. The goal, again, same with the pilgrimage, was to continue to express support for the elimination of school segregation from all public schools. But it was also a way to show that students, that young people were just as invested in integration as adults were. Again, according to A. Philip Randolph, he would say, "It is the youth who are immediately and personally affected and involved. In many respects, an expression from them is more meaningful than from the generations like myself, decades removed from schools." And so the plan in 58 was to bring 1,000 students from 4th grade to college from states all along the Eastern Seaboard to Washington, D.C. They were to assemble on Constitution Avenue, which is kind of a main roadway here in the district, if you're not familiar with the city. And they would, most of them would march to the Lincoln Memorial, where they would attend a rally, while a small a delegation would separate and march to the White House to present President Eisenhower with a petition. Now, leading the march to the Lincoln Memorial. And unfortunately, I couldn't find a good image of this. I know it's out there somewhere. But leading the march was Jackie Robinson, who had recently, of course, retired from baseball. And so he will lead the students down to the Lincoln Memorial. On one side, he will have an African-American student, and on his other side, he'll have a white student. And then leading the delegation to the White House was, excuse me, Harry Belafonte. And the idea of the group going to the White House was to essentially present President Eisenhower with a petition that included things like supporting integration of schools, to demand civil rights laws, as well as other things. Unfortunately, by the time they get there, or when they get there, they find out that the president isn't even in Washington, D.C., and none of his advisors or members of his cabinets are there to meet with this delegation. And so after about a half an hour of kind of demonstrating around the gates, they decide to leave the petition and ask for it to be forwarded to the president, and they will return and meet back up with the group at the Lincoln Memorial. And so again, this was an idea of where students themselves would sort of lead this march, I guess, if you will. There were a couple of notable attendees, individuals who would go to the White House as part of that delegation. One of those is Paula Martin, and we talked a couple times about some of the cases that happened here in Virginia, kind of locally, if you will. And Paula Martin was an 11-year-old student who fought a court battle to help integrate schools in Norfolk, Virginia. There were also two young men, Norman Bailey and Leon Thompson. They were the first Black students to attend an integrated school in Baltimore. And so again, unfortunately, they were unable to see the president, but they were able to leave their petition there for him to look at perhaps later. One person who was notably absent, though, from the 1958 march was one of the organizers, and that is Dr. King himself. He is still at this point recovering after being stabbed during a book signing event in Harlem. And so he is unable to attend, but he does write some prepared remarks, which his wife, Coretta Scott King, will deliver at the Lincoln Memorial. And among those remarks, he says, "There is a unique element in this demonstration. It is a young people's march. You are proving that the youth of America is freeing itself of the prejudices of an older and darker time in our history. Keep marching and resist injustice with the firm, nonviolent spirit you demonstrated today." So this march is considered to be relatively successful. Instead of 1,000 students attending, ultimately 10,000 people would take part in this march. And so because it is deemed successful, the decision is made to follow it up with a much larger march in 1959. One of the things that I will point out, though, is even before the youth march took place, several civil rights leaders, and you can see them in this image here, would meet with President Eisenhower in 1958, several months before the march actually occurred. Among those are, of course, Dr. King, and this will be his first White House visit. You have A. Philip Randolph, and kind of over here in the corner, you have Roy Wilkins. And the purpose of this visit was to convince President Eisenhower to speed up and to publicly support integration of all public schools. And there are going to be a series of demands or requests that they will make of President Eisenhower at this historic meeting. One is that the president should declare a nationwide pronouncement that the law will be upheld. So that was the first thing, to publicly support the Brown versus Board of Education decision. The second is to organize a White House conference of constructive leadership to discuss ways of complying peaceably with the court's ruling. And the third is to compile and make available information, resources, and advice from government agencies to all officials and community groups who are seeking to work out a program of education and action. And so these are some of the things that they asked President Eisenhower to do. He indicated at the end of the meeting that he will be glad to consider them. But again, because no, sort of headway, or he hadn't done any of these things prior to the Youth March, the decision was made to go ahead and bring these students to Washington, D.C. to let their voices be heard. So the second march will occur in 1959. Dr. King will be available and in attendance for this Youth March. It is a little bit different than the first in that it's not held at the Lincoln Memorial. Students actually march down the National Mall and will meet at a very small theater called Sylvan Theater, which is on the Washington Monument grounds. This theater still exists today. I couldn't find a photograph anywhere of Dr. King speaking here at this theater, but it is one of the sites that you can still visit. If you visit the Washington Monument, you'll certainly see it just down the hill there. But the march was kind of an effort to hold a much larger event again, building upon the efforts of the 58th March. They also signed and circulated a petition, which ultimately would get 400,000 signatures to urge the President and Congress of the United States to put into effect an executive and legislative program which will ensure the orderly and speedy integration of schools throughout the United States. And so on April 18th, 1959, an estimated 26,000 participants again marched down the mall and gathered here at the Sylvan Theater to listen to speakers, including Dr. King. His speech is one that was ultimately going to be chosen as one of the inscriptions that we have on the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial here in Washington, D.C. And in his speech, he says to his young audience to make a career of humanity, commit yourself to the noble struggle for equal rights. You will make a greater person of yourself, a greater nation of your country, and a finer world to live in. Now, like the march before, there was a small delegation that would proceed to the White House. Same thing kind of happened. They were unable to meet with President Eisenhower, but they will meet with one of his special assistants, a gentleman by the name of John Morgan, who will accept the petition and express his commitment to helping to fully integrate all schools in the United States. There was also a member of Congress that accepted the petition, who promised to make sure that it found its way into the congressional record and that it would be brought attention to the proper authorities. And so here we see three really early marches, of course, that predate the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, three that Dr. King was very much involved in, and three that all centered around this decision that was made during the Brown versus Board of Education decisions. And again, it's kind of going to be these three events that in many ways are going to sort of elevate Dr. King to the national stage. Again, if he wasn't already there before. And so if you come out to Washington, D.C., you can actually visit, again, many of these places where these marches sort of took place. So I'm going to go ahead and, if I can, stop sharing that and sort of turn it back over to Jen for any final thoughts. If anybody has any questions.
Yes, we do. Did you say if the students who attended were local or did they come from all over? Do we know?
So the first march, the vast majority of the students were from the East Coast. A lot of them coming from New York, some of the major cities that we have here. Many of them were local to the district, to the DMV, the district area. The second march, however, they wanted to make it much broader. And so you had students coming from California, coming from the Midwest, coming from the South, as well as students still coming from the East Coast as well. So there were young people from representing all corners of the United States.
Awesome. Fatima mentioned something in the chat. She said she forgot to mention that Dr. Martin Luther King became friends with Dr. Kenneth Clark and spoke very highly of Dr. Clark during the 1956 annual luncheon of the National Committee for Rural Schools. His speech was titled Desegregation and the Future. So another connection there to our two stories. As I understand it, questions have to go into the chat. So if anybody has any other questions they want to ask, we have both Fatima still here with us and Bethany to talk about the DC part of the story or the Brown decision. If anybody has anything else they would like to add. We also have Bobby standing by to connect all of this to the National Mall Gateway, which is something that the Trust for the National Mall has been working on. And if there aren't any questions, Aaron wants to know if you know of any youth marches on the National Mall after these.
Oh, no major marches that I'm aware of. I'm sure there
Not
have
with this
been.
direct connection. I'm sure
Yeah,
there
not
have
with
been
this
too.
connection. Yeah.
Yeah. We're gonna have to do some homework. This is really cool. We particularly love being able to connect with other parks and learn some new stories that connect back to our park. And so we really appreciate Fatima coming on with us and sharing the Brown story. I don't know how many of you have been to Topeka, but boy, I feel like there's a road trip in our future. So hopefully we can get out there and explore that story some more and connect to the stories. Barbara Johns, I don't know, Fatima, if you know, she just got a statue in the Capitol, I'm pretty sure, right? I hope I'm not speaking out of turn on that, but I believe she's one.
You're correct. Yeah, and our
Yeah,
superintendent was able to be in attendance for the unveiling of her statue.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Very good. Cool. Love connecting the dots. I actually had a friend who grew up near Farmville and told me the whole thing about those schools closing for so many years. It's just unbelievable that those students, you know, didn't have an option for going to school for so long. It's unbelievable. So cool. If nobody else has any other questions, I might throw it to Bobby and see if he wants to share a little of the Gateway and how you might connect to Dr. King's memorial and some of the other stories. So with us, Bobby.
Hi, I'm Ranger Jen. Thank you, Ranger Jen, of course, and thank you, Ranger Bethany and Ranger Fatima. This was an incredible program. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the Gateway. If there's more questions for any of the park rangers, feel free to keep putting them in the chat, and I will talk briefly, and we can get to there. We can, if they don't mind answering more questions, we would love for that. We saw a couple of hands up, but unfortunately, we can't get the chat out. We can't have you unmute yourself. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat. I'm going to share my screen. Great. So I just want to talk briefly about the National Mall Gateway, which is my name is Bobby Caith. I'm the product manager of the National Mall Gateway, and I was going to talk briefly about how you can use the National Mall Gateway on the National Mall or in your classroom. We have a couple different Martin Luther King resources that I wanted to point out for this specifically. So we'll go through that. We can look at the site card, which is an overview of the memorial itself, which will show you everything you want to know about the memorial. You can click into all these different pictures, see different enhanced views of the memorial. Over here, we have a little bit of an overview of the memorial and Dr. Martin Luther King himself, a timeline, and then we have all these key features showing all the different quotes and all the different features of the memorial, right? I think this is a great tool to help students and, to students or visitors when you're walking around the National Mall. Sometimes you're not exactly sure what you're seeing and why is there a mountain here and what is the significance of this mountain. Well, you can click in here and start to understand why it's there and why he is the stone of hope, right? So you can start to see that there. We have the cultural impact, and then we have reflection questions as well. So this is a great way to just be able to talk to your students about what they're seeing and ask those questions. We also have pre-built tours. Oh, hold on one second. A couple things blocking here. There we go. We have pre-built tours that when you're walking around the mall so that you can sort of connect all these things. When you're walking around, it gives you a map of the mall, of your route and how long it will take you to walk around. We have educational activities tied to each of these memorials and sites so that you can, if you want to use them in your classroom or on the mall, you can use these educational activities. They work both with students in a group, also they work with your kids. If you're, bringing your kids walking around. And then again, reflection questions there. Again, we're trying always to have reflection questions to make it easy for the adults to talk to the students about it and make sure that, you're pushing students and getting them to think a lot. Ranger Jen and Ranger Bethany were huge people in this process, creating it with us, and we're incredibly grateful for them. And then I'll talk about when you click on here into the virtual tour, it opens up all the sites here on the National Mall. So right here, we're spinning around, and Ranger Bethany and I were at the memorials at 5 a.m. together, getting these beautiful shots. Let me get over here so you can see a better view of Martin Luther King himself. And this really gives you the ability to just kind of move around the mall, to go through it, to look at it up close, and go from there. Ranger Jen, my question for you is, there's some more questions coming in. Do you guys want to answer them, or do you want to answer them and then I can wrap up towards the last one or two more minutes?
It's actually a comment about Mr. Marlin says, did you know that there was legislation in 1957 that created the Civil Rights Division in the Department of Justice? He served as a trial attorney in the division from 61 to 65. So very, very cool personal connection there too. And we appreciate you sharing. And I don't know that I knew that, so thank you.
Any other questions in the chat? Do we want to wrap it up then?
I think we're good. Your last call here. Bobby's gonna take us home, I think.
All right, I'll wrap us up. And then, so when you are, let me get there. Thank you. All right, so when you come to the National Mall Gateway, you can sign up for a teacher account. And when you sign up for a teacher account, you get access to more lesson plans and more activities. And you can see all the different, you can build your own tours yourself. So not just the pre-built tours, you can make a customized tour of anything you want on the National Mall. And when you sign up for a teacher account, if you're one of the first 250 teachers to sign up, we'll be sending out classroom kits, including this incredible map made for the semi-quincentennial, which is coming up, which we all know and we're all been thinking about and talking about all the time.
You have to tell them what it's made of. So it just looks like a thing,
Well, it is made of, we have a couple different versions, but the one Jen's talking about is a very nice cloth one, which is lovely to have in your classroom. And it is great for packing it and moving it around, or just really, it's a nice teaching resource. So it's one of those things that when we brought to National Conference on Social Studies, teachers loved it, and it was really a joy to get to see the teachers interact with it. And we have two other things to show. One is the QR code for the Gateway, and then we're also asking for teachers to be part of our advisory group. We're getting more and more teachers involved with the Gateway, both using it in their classroom and also helping us perfect it and make it better for them, right? This tool that we've created, we built from the ground up with the National Park Service and with teachers the whole time, right? The educators are the important part for us to be reaching. So we want to keep looping in more and more teachers into this. So feel free to take a picture of either QR code, but if you take a picture of the one on the right, you can then be part of our advisory group. So I think that's all I have. Thank you so much, Ranger. Thank you, Ranger Jen. Are you going to say anything?
No, I was just going to follow up and say thank you to everybody who participated and who joined us tonight. And we should be back again next month with another program. And again, thank you to Fatima for joining us, and for the Trust for hosting us, and for Bethany for compiling all this information and connecting all the stories for us. So we really appreciate it. And yeah, we look forward to connecting with you all again soon. Thank you very much.